Hello and welcome to Climateworks Centre's first briefing room for 2026. I'm Anna Scarbeck, CEO at Climateworks Centre, and I'll be your host for today's session as we explore trends that will affect climate action for businesses this year. Climateworks Centre is an independent not-for-profit with programs spanning Southeast Asia and Australia. Today, we're joined by our Australian-based experts. But of course, this topic is relevant right across the globe and in markets even without new legislation such as we've seen in Australia regarding mandatory disclosures. We know that across global trade, net zero is becoming the new normal for businesses and policymakers. And importantly, this conversation is more important than ever now. Here in Australia, climate reporting is now a live obligation for major companies, and it began last year in the same year that the Australian government has set its 2035 and net zero targets, and also released its net zero plan with 6 sector net zero plans that outline how to get there. We know that companies influence 70% of Australia's emissions, and their climate action will play a huge role in this transition. We also see that government is putting in place measures to ensure that business action is aligned with climate targets. And in addition, market shifts, as well as growing regulatory momentum, are reshaping expectations for corporate climate action. We've seen through the Australian Sustainable Finance Roadmap, mandatory reporting and transition plan disclosure requirements now exist in Australia, and there is an increasing need for workforce capability across all levels of businesses to meet new obligations and to maintain a competitive advantage. So today we'll be unpacking some of these issues during our discussion. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which each of us is dialing in today. I acknowledge traditional custodians of the lands and waters of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, where I'm joining you from today, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend my respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders joining us today. Please do use the chat to tell us where you're dialing in from. Also joining us today are 3 of my fantastic Climateworks colleagues, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce them to you now. We have Erwin Jackson, one of Australia's most respected climate policy analysts and advocates, who brings more than 35 years of experience to his role as Head of Australian Programs at Climateworks. And prior to this, Erwin was Managing Director of Policy at the Investor Group on Climate Change, the IGCC. His expertise spans government, business and the not-for-profit sector. Joining Erwin is Cassandra Williams is Climateworks' Head of Enterprise Programs and Strategy. She brings over 2 decades of experience in financial services and currently serves on the Education Committee for 100 Women in Finance and sits on the GFANZ, that's the Glasgow Financial Alliance on Net Zero, Southeast Asia Knowledge Engagement Workstream. And our final panellist is Elspeth Taylor from our Net Zero Academy. Elle brings nearly a decade of experience in project management, change leadership and organisational development to her role as Program Manager at Climateworks, where she designs and delivers the Net Zero Academy courses. So over the next hour, we'll hear from our panellists on the geopolitical and policy shifts, the first year of mandatory reporting, and why transition planning requires upskilling and behaviour change from the boardroom through right across organisations. We will also be taking your questions. So if you have something you'd love to ask, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And thank you to those of you who've already submitted questions when you registered. So without further ado, let's get into it. I'll kick off today's discussion with a question for Erwin. Erwin, with the dynamic global context, how do you see that climate is placed in the priorities of governments and businesses this year?
Well, I'm going to butcher some metaphors in my answer, so apologies. We've seen lots of geopolitical change and a lot of geopolitical uncertainty over the last year, which everyone is well familiar with. But this is not necessarily particularly new in the context of climate policy. And the analogy that I will use is it's a bit like the sea is rising with the waves also moving. So we've seen lots of geopolitical tensions over the years, but the sea has continued to rise and in terms of climate action. And what is driving that is not just climate change itself. Increasingly, we're seeing governments in particular looking at climate solutions in the context of their national security, how they manage supply chains, how they ensure energy affordability, how they manage national security. And that is not going to go away and will continue to be there. And we saw, for example, last year, twice as much investment in clean energy and associated infrastructure as we did in fossil fuels. That doesn't happen by accident, and it's not just being driven by climate action, even though climate action is a big part of that. And we're also seeing that having some real world impacts. China's emissions, for example, have been flat or declining for the last 18 months because of the major structural change that's happening in their economy as they shift to renewable electricity, EVs, and low emissions manufacturing. The other critical point, I think, in the Australian context is, obviously there's a lot of choppiness globally, but the government hasn't taken its foot off the pedal in terms of climate action in Australia. We obviously, as Anna mentioned, saw the 2035 target announcement last year and the sector plans associated with them, but the government continues to reform, and we're seeing those reforms expand in depth and scope. We've obviously seen a lot of action in the electricity sector and electricity supply around renewable energy, for example, in the last few years. But the government is not only continuing that reform, but also deepening and broadening it to the supply side of the equation as well. How do we better manage energy demand to deliver energy affordability, energy security, and also manage reliability risks associated with our aging fossil fuel generation fleet? We're also going to see some pretty major policy discussions and decisions this year to ensure that we can achieve the 2035 target, principally around how we price carbon in the industrial sector and how the safeguard mechanism will be reformed and strengthened. Similarly, in the transport sector, we'll see ongoing discussion of how we can strengthen the vehicle efficiency standards for light vehicles. But increasingly, we're going to see a focus on heavy transport. So that's again an example of government's focus on the low-hanging fruit. In the case of electricity, it was renewables. In the case of transport, it was light vehicles. Now we're seeing active consideration and discussion about how we can expand those reforms to tackle the sectors which aren't as ready or haven't traditionally been as ready as those active solutions. So to continue to butcher the metaphors, the way I sort of think about it is we're sort of on a bumpy road. We continue on a bumpy road, but the foot hasn't gone off the pedal, and we're still heading in the one direction, which is towards net zero.
Thank you. Very helpful also to shed a bit of light on what you see coming through the policy agenda, even though it's not necessarily top of the headlines when there's just so much else going on in the world. And I think that's going to be of interest to those who are tuning in today to hear about what all of this means for businesses. So continuing on that thread, when you think about where this fits in the intersection of international dynamics and this domestic policy, what's something that you think Australian businesses are underestimating right now?
Well, I'll say three things: climate change, nature, and society. Climate change itself is increasingly going to be a big disruptor. We see in the mandatory disclosure framework that assessing the physical risks of climate change is mandatory, but we are now moving from a world where climate change was having intermediate but large-scale impacts, like one-off big extreme events, to climate change impacts being normalised within our system because of the warming that's occurred in the last couple of decades. And that's just not about extreme floods and droughts and storms, etc. What we're seeing, for example, is the inflationary impacts of climate change becoming the new normal. We've seen climate change impact on inflation in the past, but it spiked through cyclones and other things. Now we're seeing ongoing structural changes in the way we think about the economy works around insurance, food prices, and energy prices, which climate change all has a role in. And that will similarly play out in how governments, both federal, state, and local, manage their budgets and what they can spend, because climate change recovery costs are increasing, like they're $15 billion over the last few years. And to put that into context, the expansion of the NDIS in the last budget was $2 billion. So these are very large and substantive impacts, and they're not going to go away. And they're going to continue, climate change will continue to disrupt the economy, communities, workforces, supply chains, and that's something that I think businesses are underestimating. The other is the integration of nature and climate change. You know, nature and climate change integration has not gone away. We're increasingly seeing central banks, security agencies start to think about the intersection between nature and the financial system or national security. But we're also going to continue to see pressure towards thinking about how businesses and governments can integrate nature and climate policy together. On the policy side, an example of that would be that every sector plan that sits underneath the 2035 targets impacts on our landscape, whether it be renewable energy projects, infrastructure, critical minerals, carbon sequestration, liquid fuels, carbon sinks. They're all impacting on the land, and we need to think about how we integrate those effectively all together into policy. The other areas in finance, where I think one of the things that potentially business is underestimating is the availability of the tools that are now available to report and have the data for how you actually think about nature-related risks. We've done a lot of work in the last few years developing Australia's natural capital catalogue, which is available online for businesses to use. But we're also doing increasingly work with governments, local and regional catchment authorities around how you model and integrate all the different impacts on landscapes together and what that means and how we best manage those processes. So the tools are quickly emerging for us to start thinking about and assessing and managing nature and climate risks together. The third is the social elements. Climate change itself, as I mentioned, will already impact this, and the National Climate Risk Assessment earlier in the year, or late last year, whenever it was, identified that we're likely to see social tipping points as a result of climate change, whether that be, and we're already seeing examples of that where major extreme events are causing towns to move and the social disruption that's caused and the community connections that they've built. But we're also going to see it in the context of the places in which the transition is happening. And increasingly, this is a bit related to my first point, climate solutions in places like our industrial zones are not just going to be seen through the prism of getting up a decarbonisation project. They're also going to be seen through the prism of what health benefits do they deliver? What are the social infrastructure we need around that to actually deliver that? So businesses, I think, need to be thinking about not just climate change as a siloed problem, but one which is going to impact on the places in which they operate in across the entire system.
Thanks very much, Erwin. You've outlined the risks that are facing businesses and the global context. I'm going to turn to Cass now for how businesses can respond and integrate their knowledge of those risks and the tools that you've mentioned. Cass, you know quite well that there is now mandatory climate reporting in Australia and transition planning emerging, which begins to normalise for businesses that it's time to take all the stuff that Erwin was talking about into account in your corporate planning, and there are new obligations around that. Can you tell us how you see companies are or can use this as an opportunity more than only a disclosure exercise?
Yeah, thanks, Anna, and thanks, Erwin. The starting point from any type of disclosure from companies is that it shouldn't just be a compliance exercise. Nobody wants to fill out a form just for the sake of it, and the climate-related financial disclosures are just that. It should be absolutely decision useful for your company, for investors, for stakeholders, for suppliers, for your ecosystem. Our work is very focused on lifting the quality and credibility of the disclosures so that they can be used to inform real business decisions. Climate-related financial disclosures are mandatory. Group 1 has already gone, Group 2 about to go, Group 3 after that. So if you're not already caught up in climate-related financial disclosures, you will be soon. And within mandatory disclosures, there is a requirement that if you have a transition plan, that you must disclose it. But as more investors, supply chains, customers are requiring transition plans, it really takes out that optionality. And what we've been able to do is work with organisations, work with government to be able to lift the standard. The organisations that are leaning into the transition plan and the reporting as a strategic stress test will come out best. They're asking, what does climate risk mean for their business model? Or as Erwin said, the extensions beyond climate into social and nature. But what it also means for their balance sheet, for their customers, and where their capital needs to go in their CapEx allocation over the next 5, even to the next decade. Because the important thing here is if you've got a plan by 2030, it should actually be represented in your transition plan now, because it's about what you're investing in now. What are you going to phase out? Where is your research and development going to go? And how does that capital expenditure align with your pathway? It tells a complete story. I have likened this, it's a target without a plan is just an execution strategy. I've likened this to my eldest daughter wanting to live in Copenhagen. And I said, that's great, but what's your plan? How are we going to fund it? What's your flight path? Are you living there? Are you studying? So not having that plan or that execution strategy to a target can actually get you into trouble when it comes to transition plans. So it's really critical that you've thought behind this. But it's not just a disclosure requirement, as we said, and it's not just for external stakeholders. Boards and executive management need to know this information. Climate risk is a material risk, and being transparent about the assumptions that you made to adjust to that risk is so important. The things you're thinking around policy, technology, your customers, how the market is shaping. And as Erwin mentioned, this is also an economic and an inflation risk. It's not just that your insurance prices will go up because you're in a flood-bound area. But also, markets are increasingly differentiating between companies that acknowledge that risk and companies that show how they're managing it and what the plan is. And this is all incorporated into the transition plan. But I'm not going to lie to you, it is a mixed bag of what's out there. And that's okay. We're still in the early stages. Some are really robust and integrated into financial planning. Others are really largely narrative. But, we're still in the early stages, so that's not surprising. But the ambition is lifting. The game is going to get harder. Group 2 reporting will go very soon. Treasury will release their guidance on transition planning very soon. Climateworks has published our credibility guide on what makes a transition plan genuinely decision useful. And I know someone's going to include that in the links. It's a free resource. And if you're in the middle of transition planning and you're in the thick of climate-related financial disclosures, read it. One of our stakeholders said to us, if you had released that 1 year earlier, it would have saved me probably 6 months of my time. So we're glad we're helpful. There are many requirements of transition plans in the market. If you're seeking debt, equity, suppliers, we want them to be useful. So what we want to make sure is that the bar is lifting and that transition plans in the market are useful. For example, with banks, when you're assessing a transition plan, aligning it back to the credibility tells you if you're getting what you need to know from a transition plan. Our climate intelligence in our market is growing rapidly, and we have the Sustainable Finance Roadmap to thank for that. Australia has built one of the most comprehensive climate reporting architectures in the world. So, well done, pat ourselves on the back. Our climate intelligence is world leading. We've got climate-related financial disclosures. We've got a taxonomy. We've got transition planning guidance. We've got product labelling coming up. We've got digitisation through the Council of Financial Regulators coming through on climate-related financial data and transition plans. It is moving at lightning speed. So I can appreciate sometimes that your head is spinning because we live and breathe this every single day, and keeping up is part of our job. But as the transparency increases, so do expectations. Every year, it will be about getting better. Markets will lift, suppliers will lift, and government expectations will lift. But the reason why we focus so much on capacity building within our programs of work is that data is just data on a page unless you have the humans and the people behind the reporting that can make sense of it. This is not just your ESG and your corporate social responsibility teams. It is your finance teams. It is your risk teams. It is your sustainability leads. And it's also your board of directors who have a duty of care to the company to know their climate risks and understand and have the capability to interpret and use this information properly. A lot of organizations are realizing that, the bottleneck isn't about willingness because it's mandatory, you have to do it. A lot of it, and the first step is about capability. The people building the numbers and the plans that sit behind it, they just need the skills to turn the disclosure into the decisions. We're all about uplifting our capability in a whole raft of things. Climate should be absolutely no different. Because reporting won't change a company's climate journey, the capability of your individual people within your organisation to interpret it and act on it absolutely will.
Okay, that's a great overview of the journey that companies are going on right now. And I know from the work that we're doing with some of those companies that are through that journey right to the transition planning point, and we see climate transition plans becoming a new normal, we're seeing that companies then realise that they need their own company's transition plan to align with what's happening in the sector that they're in, that they recognise this is, of course, a bigger issue than themselves, and it influences the equipment and markets that their suppliers and customers are operating. Can you tell us a little bit about how companies can navigate this while in parallel to their own obligations? We're seeing government publishing national sector plans and more of that climate intelligence on the public side as well as the private side that you referred to.
Thank you. I've spoken about this on a number of different forums, and I like to always kick off with no company is an island. Everyone operates within their own domestic ecosystem, within their international markets, within their sectors. And both Anna and Erwin have said a lot about our sector decarbonisation plans, and that's really where we're heading here. A credible transition plan is ultimately the company's responsibility. How you navigate and how you assess climate risk is a company's responsibility. It's how you allocate capital, your strategy, your governance, and your board risk. But decarbonisation won't happen in isolation. It has to happen in sectors. We look at airports, we look at airlines, we look at transportation. When a national sector plan sets out a 1.5 degree pathway, it creates a target, it creates a benchmark. This means that companies need to explain how their plans align with that direction of travel, and importantly, why it might be different. So there are two things here. If you're going slower than your sector, than your peers, then you might need to explain why. Do you need to lift your game? If the tech is out there, why aren't you using it? If the capabilities in hard to abate sectors are available domestically or globally, why is it not within your R&D or your CapEx or your OpEx in your transition plan? But even if you're going faster, we applaud that, but is it sustainable? And will you be able to sustain that advantage? And a term that I'm going to use later on, well, actually a term that was used yesterday in one of our presentations from our sustainable economies team, Lily used a word called co-opetition, and I really like it. It's the combination of competition and collaboration, and that is exactly what the sector needs to do. Companies mostly compete on execution, innovation, and capital efficiency. They collaborate but they can collaborate on conditions, infrastructure, standards, supply chains, policy signals, all the things that we were talking about beforehand. Erwin mentioned our industrial decarbonisation programs. We use industrial precincts as an example. Bringing together precincts, like it's what Climateworks does. It's our jam. If a company can commit to electrification or low emission fuels in its transition plan, that's going to depend on grid capability, shared infrastructure, and coordinated planning. And that just doesn't happen because we ask for it or we wish it out into the universe. It comes together with very coordinated approach. A project that we've got going with local councils at the moment is a great example of where we can play a practical role here. And this is what Climateworks does. Remember Lily's word of co-opetition. It came up with governments working together. The same can be said for companies and peers within sectors. When we're looking at how local councils can help, they've got a whole lot of businesses that are diverse within a precinct, a shared location, shared infrastructure. They can create clarity about what's going to be built and when. It reduces uncertainty. We all know uncertainty gives you risk, business risk, and keeps you awake at night. It accelerates private investment and can lower doubling up on assets or even assets that are stranded. But it doesn't matter if you're a local council, you're a government, you're a policy or sectors. It will not substitute for corporate action. This is not a get out of jail free. This is a way to have a visitor, to enable your action to be amplified and to work together. Companies still need to commit capital and move first. The credible ones don't wait for the sector to mature. They help shape it. They are the market makers, and that's our sweet spot, working with those market makers. So if that resonates with you and you think that you're a market maker, you should definitely call us and we'll have a chat. Navigating the competitive collaboration and doing this well means two things, and these are the things that I want you to take away and remember. Firstly, if you align your transition plan with credible sector benchmarks, credible being the word, and target, so investors and stakeholders can see you understand the broader market transition and the ecosystem that you're working in, it'll be better for you. Secondly, if you demonstrate leadership within that system, collaborate where it strengthens the sector, and compete on execution, you will be well and truly market best practice. The sector alignment is, the important part here is it doesn't lower your expectations. It actually just makes your performance far more valuable than it ever would be. So you need to be in the mix.
Yes, that's super helpful. We've got one more panelist to hear from, but if you've got questions arising from Cass or Erwin, please pop them in the Q&A section of your tab down the bottom, and we'll have a moment after we hear from Elspeth to address the questions all in one group. So, Elspeth, we've heard from Erwin and Cass those big picture challenges in the external context and at the sector level for companies. You're program manager for Net Zero Academy, and you're working with the people who are trying to implement net zero within their organisations. Can you tell us what are some of the challenges that you're seeing on a more granular level?
Absolutely. Thanks, Anna. I think for this next little session, we're going to be taking a real deep dive. We've been looking quite economy-wide so far, but I'm going to be taking you directly into an organisation for the next little session. My role is very exciting. I get to work with a range of different people who come to our courses, from executives and senior leaders who are leading this work in their businesses, through to those who are delivering this work as well, the practitioners who are actually identifying those risks and opportunities or implementing their transition plan. I'm really fortunate that I get to work with people from all over across the economy, from a range of different sectors. And one of the things that actually brings me the most joy is getting all of those different people into a room and seeing where, despite the many differences in their approach, in their businesses, in their sectors, where those common challenges or opportunities are arising. So a big one for me that we see time and time again really relates now to what Cass was referring to earlier. Climate is no longer just something that, your sustainability team looks after. It's not just ESG. It's not just something that you can look at, separately to your business. It's now a really core part of how a business should be operating if you want to really take advantage of the opportunities that climate can show by taking effective action. As an example there, we're looking at reporting. If you're managing your reporting through the mandatory disclosures, you need to involve your risk teams. You need to involve your finance teams. It's no longer just something that your sustainability team can manage. You need to work together to be able to effectively report. Similarly, there is a trend that we've seen so far, I think when it particularly comes down to things like ESG, that it tends to be seen as something that can sit within corporate affairs or more of that external facing piece when it comes to organisational design. What we're seeing more and more is that instead of it being part of something that, we're creating a narrative around it and communicating it to our partners or our customers, it's now really becoming embedded in the strategy or the risk or operations of a business. And that's really key if you want to see the opportunities that Cass was talking about being that first leader and that first mover. finally there, if we're also looking at the implementation of a transition plan, you're going to need to use the skills and the knowledge of everyone on the ground from the factory floor all the way through to your board members to be able to effectively implement your transition plan. So often I feel like transition planning can feel quite nebulous, or it can be quite conceptual, but on the ground it's really quite practical. It's a project management guide. It's not something that's terribly new, and it will rely on people implementing those actions. If you're focusing on a new kind of technology, you will need someone to operate that technology, and that will be a change to that person. So you really need people involved at all levels of your organisation now. It's no longer something that's just off to the side. It's a real strategic and operational advantage to be looking at this now. Particularly, as Cass was saying earlier, this is only going to become more and more normalized. This is already happening. The lightning speed that we're moving at is just going to increase. This is the very beginning, and the earlier that you can build these skills and build this capability, the better off you'll be. So looking at all of that and considering how we're changing how we're looking at climate within an organisation, a big piece that we're really seeing from our participants, who are the ones who are leading this work in their organisations, is that this is fast becoming a personnel challenge. It's becoming a behavioural challenge. It's less of a technical challenge. As Erwin was saying, Australia is actually really leading the way when it comes to innovation. We're a fast mover when it comes to new technology. Often the technology is there and ready for us to use, or the solutions are there for us. We're now seeing more of the challenges is it's about bringing the people on the journey with you. So when we're talking about bringing people on the journey, we're talking about people who throughout maybe their entire careers, or through university, they haven't necessarily considered climate to be part of their core role. It hasn't necessarily been something that they've had to consider as part of their responsibility. So a big part of the transition and a big part of adapting climate into your organisation to be something that is a real strategic advantage is about communicating and bringing people on that journey to really see where they can contribute and how they can support climate to be embedded across their organisation as well. Easier said than done. We talk a lot about that narrative piece and around understanding your stakeholders and understanding where they're coming from, what they're motivated by, and what their interests are, to be able to bring them on that journey too. The thing that excites me so much and that gets me so excited at the end of a day of delivery and working with participants in our courses is that when we're looking at these challenges that we're facing, we're looking at climate change as one of our biggest challenges that we're facing as a society at the moment, one of the many. It's a huge, challenging, unprecedented time to be alive. The opportunities that we can find when we're well-versed and upskilled in this space really benefit everyone. So when you're looking at everyone from the factory floor all the way through to board level, there are opportunities that can arise if you're willing to take the time to understand what that might be, and have those conversations and really listen as well to the people who are on the ground and have those deep content and expertise in what they do. So it's really about listening. It's about applying and taking those people on the journey, as it's now everyone's responsibility.
Thank you. That's a great insight from your lived experience on what it's like to be the people that are trying to address this new era of the compulsory side of disclosure and planning, and turning it into an opportunity side. And we've heard loud and clear from you, Elspeth, that what that shift means really is that this becomes a whole of organisation issue. And you've outlined that presents some new challenges for organisations and the people in them, as well as opportunities. Do you want to share a little bit more on the how part? How does an organisation make the shift from something that one team used to do and talk about to something that's embedded in an organisation from top down?
Absolutely. The first thing that I'd say is that leadership is critical. Having supportive leadership right from that board level, from that director level, is a real game changer when it comes to seeing these changes across the organisation. If you're a sustainability team member and this is new for you and your board doesn't necessarily get it or your directors aren't necessarily across it, have those conversations. We've heard from participants that, it took up to 6 multi-hour workshops with their board for them to really get what we're talking about here, to really get why it's important to engage in this. It can take time, but spending that time supporting your leadership to really understand the benefits that engaging in this work can have for their organisation is a really critical first step. Having supportive leadership can lead to a range of positive outcomes, a key one there being around governance. Effective governance is obviously a key part of mandatory disclosures. It's a key part of a transition plan. Making sure that there is accountability organisation-wide is really key, and that accountability is monitored, and those successes or lessons learned are also captured. So having that leadership engage in those governance models and support them from the very top is really important. Secondly, for leaders, engaging in this work provides that really positive role model from the top down for the rest of your organisation to follow. If your leaders aren't prepared to walk the walk, neither will your staff members. So making sure that, again, they're on board and that they're engaged and, again, doing the work and as Cass was saying, using this data and using this information to make decisions is a really key first step. Excitingly, with mandatory disclosures, as I'm sure many of you are aware, directors are liable now for those mandatory disclosures if you are required to report. And that we've seen it just in, the stories that are coming through to our from our participants, just how much more engaged board members and executives are now that they're required to put their stamp, put their signature to these reports. So that's also another really great narrative that you can take to your board as well, is that this is becoming the new normal, something that you need to do. Finally, with leadership, a key thing there that they will need to do is make sure that there are funding and, as Cass was saying, capital allocation that effectively supports your transition plan and your actions that you're taking to meet these requirements. As much as we'd love to be able to say that 9 times out of 10 any action on climate change will actually save you money, there are obviously always going to be initial outlays and there will be projects that will have a cost, and there will be a cost definitely involved in making sure that your organisation is aware and on board with this kind of work as well. So having that leadership support, knowing that that buy-in is there and knowing that those decisions can be effectively made is a really critical step. So leadership is absolutely key. Getting them on board first is vital. On the flip side though, there are many aspects across an organisation where it's really important, I think, as we were saying earlier, to engage stakeholders with where they're coming from and where they're at and what their priorities are. If we want to build climate literacy throughout an organisation and build that engagement with this work, it's important to really remember that each of the people that you're working with brings their own level of expertise in their area, and that's going to be critical. A big one that we see is that quite often when we're looking at risk identification, it might be, a risk team in a room in HQ coming up with some risks that they might see relating to climate, relating to their business. But that risk profile can change quite quickly as soon as you step out of headquarters and maybe go down to the factory floor or head out to the farms or your shops or wherever you are and actually have the conversation with the people on the ground. Their awareness of the risks that impact the work that they do is of a level of detail that's much harder to be able to gain if you're just kind of sitting in a room at HQ. So really spending that time understanding where they're coming from and being able to listen and engage is a far more effective way for you to create quality, credible identification of risks and opportunities, and also to come up with really quality and credible solutions to be able to support your transition plan too. When we're talking about this as well, I think the last thing I do want to mention, I could go for years about the kinds of skills that you do need, for your risk team, for your operations teams, for your executives. There's climate literacy that is embedded across all of those roles. But I think the thing that I really want to iterate is that when you first start doing this work, when you first start looking at, oh my gosh, my climate risks, oh my gosh, my transition plan, it can feel quite overwhelming. The thing that I'd really like to iterate is that the skills required here to take this data and to take this opportunity and to translate that into strategic benefit and strategic opportunity, these are all skills that you already have. We already have risk identification and mitigation skills in your organisation. You already have a team who's well versed in understanding how strategy works and how to make effective decisions when it comes to strategy. You already have a finance team who is well versed in financial reporting, but also on how to make effective financial decisions. You have those skills in your organisation. The difference here is around understanding the content and understanding how to apply that knowledge of the solutions that are out there, what your peers are doing, what the sector is doing, what Australia is doing, and really take that knowledge, understand your assumptions, understand the detail there, and apply that using the skills that you already have. So it's more around understanding the content here, less around creating brand new skills from scratch. It's more about applying that to the work that you already do every single day.
Thanks very much, Elspeth. That final point is a great summary of what I noticed in your answer to the earlier part of the question when you were talking about the how does an organisation do this? And you didn't mention climate once. The how part is exactly as you noted, a pretty standard governance and project management framework with a strategy and risk component. And we certainly found that when we at Climateworks worked on the credible guide to transition plans that Cass mentioned earlier. And we gathered up all the best practice analysis from around the world and looked at the key elements and made it realistic for the Australian context and new legislation here. And it's the same point there. What they were all saying was largely things you would have already been taught if you've done an MBA or you've done a company director's course, that you need to understand the strategic direction and the risks, allocate governance responsibilities for it, ensure there's resources, ensure there's employee capability, ensure you're working with your stakeholders. None of it was that different to what businesses do already. But as you say, the content is a whole new area of knowledge. Businesses are also used to, once we didn't digitise and now we have learned that. Now we're learning about AI. We've learned a lot about gender inclusion. We've learned a lot about other issues and topics. And so, again, onboarding that knowledge base, as you highlighted, is an additional effort right now while applying it within frameworks that might feel quite familiar. So thanks very much for sharing those insights from your Net Zero Academy programs. And there's a link that's been put in the chat for anyone who hasn't done one of these programs and would like to. There's another series being run this year. So that now brings me to you, our audience. I want to thank our panellists, Erwin Jackson, Cass Williams and Elspeth Taylor, and anyone who is just tuning in who missed the start. Welcome to the first Climateworks Centre briefing room for 2026. And I'm Anna Scarbeck, CEO at Climateworks Centre and your host today, talking about key trends in climate action for businesses in 2026. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you can click on like this video and subscribe to our channel. If you registered or you had colleagues who did and couldn't make it today, there will be a recording and that will be shared by email. We do have time for some of the questions that the audience members who registered submitted earlier. And if anyone wants to add any more into the Q&A function here live, you can. And so I'm going to, and I know that because we submitted them earlier, our panellists have taken a little bit of extra time in some of the questions that I asked in order to bring in some responses. For example, there was a question about local councils, and I know that Cass gave an illustration there. We've had some questions about nature, and I know that Erwin touched on that. But one of the questions that I do want to kick off with here, Erwin, to you, is top of the pops right now, of course, for many people. Let's talk about the real world impacts we're seeing as a direct result of changed US policy. Now, Erwin, I'm not expecting you to be an expert in the last 48 hours of changed US policy regarding Middle East actions, but I know you've been very closely following the changed US policy and climate over the last many months and years. So perhaps you might bring that lens to what does this mean for our conversation today on business climate action.
Well, I think the core point to reflect on really goes to what I said when I first answered to the question that climate action is a megatrend that is not going away. The US policy positions on a whole range of things has caused a lot of uncertainty with business. And I think my observation would be that the risk for business is that they get so caught up in what's happening in the short term, but they don't necessarily look at the underlying structural changes that are going on in the energy system, the economy, and society in response to climate change. And those businesses that keep their eye on that are going to be able to identify the opportunities and be better positioned as we move forward. So, I think I've been involved in climate change policy for a very long time, and I have seen various changes in US government policy over that time under different administrations. But at the end of the day, um, economics will trump politics to an extent, and the economics of the solutions that we currently have are becoming increasingly attractive to government for a whole range of reasons, not just for climate policy reasons. The fact that renewable energy is now the cheapest source of new generation pretty much anywhere on the planet is a very good message for many governments when they hear that, because they see lower power prices. So they're not going to just be acting from the point of view of climate change. They're going to be thinking about their own self-interests. And those self-interests are not going to go away in the context of the next few years of the Trump administration.
And indeed, the other actions of the Trump administration in the Middle East have prompted conversations today about self-interest in regards to oil security or liquid fuel security or energy security, and how the next purchase of a vehicle can shelter any vehicle owner, if they choose an EV, from future spikes or risks in the supply of the physical fuel. We had another question in the audience about how does a transition plan differ from a net zero or a decarbonisation plan? Elspeth, would you like to give a brief answer to that one? Elle is frozen. While she's frozen, the very short answer is a transition plan is the language used for a company, while a decarbonisation plan or a net zero plan is traditionally the language often used for a nation. They are, in fact, the same set of tasks, solving for achieving a pathway to net zero emissions in either the economy or jurisdiction that you operate in or the company that you manage. So they are one and the same in substance, but there's been this differentiation in language for who is the producer of it. And that's then yielding to areas such as new fields of transition finance. We've heard a lot about green bonds, and now there's discussion around how can we align finance products to the transition pathway, not simply the asset class. We could have another whole webinar on that another day. But I know we're running out of time for today, and a couple of other questions have come in. So there's been more than one question about ASSB guidance. I might ask Cass to take not just the first question on where can we find guidance on how to use ASSB, but there was an earlier question about ASSB might be the trigger now for action, but what will be the ongoing driver? What do you see coming down the pipeline beyond the current ASSB S2 that might mean that companies need to stay on this journey, as you say, that each year the expectations rise? Would you like to take both of those ASSB related ones, Cass?
We have had an interesting journey so far with AASB, and I am a recovering accountant, so I actually really like accounting standards because I actually think that it normalizes the way that we report and also makes the interpretation much easier. I think, as Erwin had said, nature will be a big focus. We will have TNFD, which is the nature equivalent for climate. The Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures will become far more apparent in the next very short period of time. Expectations will increase. So we've already got, we talk about climate intelligence all the while. The AESB, the Sustainable Finance Roadmap with all of the 10 components to it, has given us an amazing amount of data. What's next? What else do we need to make good financial decisions? So nature is one. We'll also be looking at circular economy. We will be looking at other parts of the climate ecosystem, water, for example. How are we incorporating this? I sometimes phrase this question in terms of double materiality, and that's just a fancy term for considering of what does your company do that can affect the environment, but also what is the impact of the environment back on your company? And when we have more data coming through, it actually gives us better insights. And then we can look at, well, what is the next tranche of information coming through? I don't have a crystal ball. All I can say is TNFD. If you're not across it, you should definitely get across it because it will be coming into, it is thick and fast coming through accounting standards worldwide.
Thank you. The questions are coming in thick and fast as well. I'm going to merge a few and summarise them and then suggest that Erwin might add something further about the renewable heat work that we've been doing and also some of the work on industry. We had a question about hospitals. They're energy intensive, produce a lot of waste. Can a company's ESG guidelines be applied to hospitals? The answer is yes. The reason I link it to the other demand side question in the Q&A chat from Louise Vickery was that actually do companies have the energy knowledge or data to really understand how to reduce their energy? And so I know that question was directed at Elspeth. I'm going to save, Elle, the last question for you, which was, I have to do my organisation's transition plan. Where do I start? I'll save that last one for you. But Erwin, I wondered if you might share what you've observed about the work with this mid-size industrial sector, commercial and industrial, hospitals, businesses that are energy users but needing to now become more energy smart, the demand side that you were speaking about earlier.
Well, first to acknowledge Louise and her contribution to the energy efficiency conversation in Australia over the last few decades. I think we're at the beginning of the journey. I know there's been a lot of like energy efficiency and the demand side have been, sort of always secondary in the conversation. I think what we're seeing in terms of the signals that the federal government is sending is that we are at the beginning of a journey that will touch many, many businesses. The reality is that many are not ready. They are, for good reason, caught up with surviving every day, making sure people are employed, making sure they're producing products. And I think this is where there's going to be a role for companies themselves in starting to think about it and what the energy savings are, but also some real leadership that will need to come from state and federal governments in terms of mapping out how we deliver a real national demand strategy that actually unlocks the potential. If you think of commercial and industrial users, the use of flexible technologies and demand amongst those customers across the nation could reduce emissions by 10% and gas use by 15%. It's a very substantial opportunity. We're at the beginning of trying to unlock it, and Climateworks is very committed to working with stakeholders in the system to ensure that we actually have the suite of policies that we're going to need to deliver that, because it's not just going to be one single policy. It's going to need information. We're going to need rule changes in the electricity market. We're going to need new laws. We're going to need new regulations and information and new contracts and derivatives in the electricity market to make all this work. And that's a journey that we're going to have to go over the next few years.
Thanks, Erwin. And it is a journey that's now underway. And as you say, building on the foundations of work done over many years by Louise and colleagues. And I'm proud to say there's many new recent reports on the Climateworks website that are continuing this analysis of the opportunities in commercial and industrial energy optimisation. And we're certainly seeing increased focus on the demand side from Australia's policymakers and also the governance of AEMO and the grid and the energy system itself. So encouraging direction, although still much more to go, as you highlighted, Erwin. So with our last minutes, Elle, I'm going to hand to you. And for those who are watching online, you can also look in the chat for some links in response to the hospitals question with a healthcare guide that Climateworks and Monash colleagues worked on last year. And else, the question around where do I start if I have to do a transition plan? And in the link, you'll find the Net Zero Academy course chat, which is a good place to start if you haven't done one. But what else would you add to that final question, Elspeth?
I mean, absolutely. Anna, come to our courses. No, that feels a bit cheeky. There's much more to it, but I think essentially taking a step back and taking a breath about it is a really helpful place to start, because you just start like any other change that you'd be making or any other project that you'd be leading. You start with where you are. So where is your organisation? What are your risks when it comes to climate? What are your opportunities when it comes to climate? When you're looking at your physical risks, what are they? What about your transition risks? Understand where you are now to help yourself then identify where you want to be in the future. Other things to consider with understanding where you are now is also looking at your emissions footprint, that emissions accounting piece. Louise, I know that there's a lot to it, and there are skills definitely required to be able to have an effective conversation around your emissions profile as an organisation and how to manage that. But that is your first step there, is to really understand where you are now, what your emissions profile is looking like, what your risks and opportunities are. But I think the thing that often gets missed, and I'm not sure if you can tell, this is a big favourite topic of mine, is the people. This is a collaborative effort. As Cass was saying, this is across sectors. You need to be working with your competitors. You need to be working up and down your value chain. So have those relationships in place. Similarly, have those relationships in place across your organisation. We've been talking a lot about how this is now spread across an organisation. So build that in early. Build those trusted relationships with your board. Make sure your directors are on board with you, that they're backing you all the way with this. That can take some time. Invest it. It's going to be useful down the line. Similarly, start to build those relationships across the organisation with key people, key influencers across your organisation who really understand how the business works. So whether that's someone on the shop floor, whether that's someone in the finance team, make sure those relationships are in place, because that is going to be critical for you to both design and then implement this work. So where you're starting, start with where you're at, understand your current state, but build those relationships. I think that's something that's so often missed, and it is genuinely the biggest factor in success when it comes to creating your transition plan and delivering it effectively.
Thank you, and well said. And with my final minute, I will wrap up with some thank yous. I want to thank our fabulous panellists, Erwin, Cass and Elspeth, and I want to thank my important colleagues behind the scenes, Simon Brown, Sophie Stekanakis, Amrit Barbara, Arwen Summers, and also thank you to Claire Barley and the Net Zero Academy team. Our 2026 program begins later this month with a session on climate transition plans. Dates and details are available on the website that was shared in the link. Of course, you can get in touch directly, and you can find out anything else and more about Climateworks on our website, climateworkscentre.org, and you will see there, as well as in your inbox in a few days, a recording of this session. And stay tuned, we will be sending information about our future briefing room events. We run these regularly throughout the year, and we would love to be joined by you again. Hope you found today helpful, and look forward to staying in touch. Find us on the website. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.